Ladies and gentlemen, time to cut through the circus act. Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller recently declared that recent economic data support keeping interest rates on hold, but promised that should inflation behave like it did in 2024, we might see rate cuts at some point this year. You might be forgiven for thinking, wait, rate cuts? After all that economic time bomb we just survived. But that's just the Fed's latest way of tiptoeing around reality. When policymakers start throwing around conditional promises like, if 2025 turns out like 2024, rate cuts will come, you know that there's more political posturing than concrete evidence at hand. Let's peel away the layers of this performance. On one level, we see the classic hallmarks of policy paralysis, misguided confidence in a sweet spot labor market, repeated claims of consumer price index, CPI, numbers being mildly disappointing, and the spooky specter of residual seasonality haunting the data. And behind the curtain, we witness government management introducing uncertainty on a stage where data should always be king. But is this just another round of central bank doublespeak? Let's find out. Waller's remarks provide the snapshot. The Fed recently slashed rates by a percentage point in the closing months of 2024, a move that many hoped would stoke economic fire. Come January, however, rates were left unchanged. On the surface, this cautious optimism appears as if the central bank has its act together, waiting for better data to roll in. But if you dig a little deeper, you see a policy that seems to be on autopilot. Waller observed that the data, the consumer price index, for instance, popped up by 0.5% in January, the most dramatic leap since August 2023. Mildly disappointing, he said. But here's the kicker, underneath this modest increase lies a disconcerting pattern. Critics argue that the CPI figures, which many business watchers and economists swear by, might be suffering from residual seasonality. According to Waller and fellow officials like Philadelphia Fed President Patrick Harker, seasonal adjustments are not keeping pace with a fast-changing economy. In simpler terms, the numbers might be dressed up like a turkey at Thanksgiving, but underneath, the stuffing is all over the place and not properly accounted for. Seen as the highest since August 2023, this should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was brushed off as mildly disappointing. This is akin to saying that a hurricane is only a bit breezy. With estimates pegging a rise of 0.25% in January and 2.6% annually, the Fed prefers this gauge over the CPI. But isn't it the same story with the same undercurrents? Data specialists remind us that the focus on core measures can sometimes hide flashy numbers that affect everyday consumers. If you're an ordinary American checking prices at the grocery store or a multinational corporation planning its next investment, clarity is crucial. Yet here we have policymakers telling us to hold our horses until clearer data emerges, even while the complex statistical wizardry behind seasonal adjustments remains murky. Are we really comfortable riding this roller coaster of uncertainty? Let's talk seasonality, folks. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is supposed to perform magic tricks on raw data, removing seasonal factors so that we can compare month-to-month changes in the economy. But now, even the Fed's sharpest minds are questioning if these adjustments truly remove trends like recurring patterns in weather, production cycles, and price hikes. Waller commented that there appears to be some residual seasonality in the CPI readings. Essentially, the fear is that the adjustments are not quite cleaning up after Mother Nature's persistent influence, leaving behind a ghost of seasonal fluctuations. Philadelphia Fed President Patrick Harker even noted that in the last decade, CPI inflation in January has surprised on the upside in 9 out of 10 years. This is not a bug, it's a glaring design flaw. Recent research into seasonal adjustments in Eurozone data has shown that even sophisticated models can fall short in rapidly evolving economies. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBR, indicated that standard seasonal adjustments might underestimate inflation by up to 0.3 percentage points during certain periods. In the United States, similar analyses have found that when CPIs are revisited after an initial reading, the upward revisions tend to be systematic, suggesting that the seasonal models are losing steam when it comes to volatility. If policy decisions hinge on data that might be fundamentally misrepresented due to residual seasonality, can the Fed truly claim confidence? The answer appears to be an uneasy no. The central bank's hand seems tied. It must act on incoming data even if that data is as murky as a half-cleaned kaleidoscope. Meanwhile, American households and investors are left trying to interpret signals that might be as clear as mud. In its latest commentary, the Fed painted a picture of an economy with a labor market that is right in the sweet spot. But if you've been following the news over the past several years, you know that the labor market often acts as a canary in the coal mine, yet, sometimes it sings the wrong tune. Examining real wages and employment trends. Unemployment rates have recently hovered around historic lows, about 3.5% to 4% in many parts of the country, suggesting robustness. However, underlying issues such as job quality, wage growth mismatches, and disparity in earnings cast doubts on the notion of a sweet spot. A report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, observed that even as jobs are created, real wages haven't consistently risen in tandem with productivity. This disparity hints that while the headline numbers look good, the reality for many workers is less rosy. Furthermore, the gig economy and automation trends are remaking labor market dynamics, meaning that even a sweet spot might be nothing more than a mirage in an otherwise turbulent desert. The Fed's reassurance of a robust labor market is certainly good news for those with secure positions. But for the 40% of Americans feeling the metro shutdown pinch, this sweet spot might be artificially maintained by policies that prop up rather than genuinely improve labor market conditions. It's like band-aiding a bullet wound, the symptom is hidden temporarily, but the underlying problem remains unaddressed. Perhaps the most damning commentary from Waller is his caution against letting uncertainty, which the new Trump administration has injected into the economic mix, delay necessary policy responses. Waiting for economic uncertainty to dissipate is a recipe for policy paralysis, he warned. In plain talk, this means that even with murky forecasts and shifting numbers, the Fed is doomed to react slowly and cautiously. In recent months, major policy shifts, from aggressive tariff impositions to regulatory adjustments, have introduced a significant degree of short-term volatility. For example, import tariffs have been touted as a temporary boost to domestic production, but many economists argue they simply delay the inevitable market corrections and, in fact, contribute to higher consumer prices. Recent data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York suggests that uncertainty in policy can lead to a decline in business investments by as much as 15% during periods of heightened political risk. This dramatic decline is enough to seriously slow economic momentum, even if the headline unemployment figures remain low. Waller's comments come off as a fascinating blend of economic orthodoxy mixed with political evasiveness. Yes, he details the challenges with the current inflation readings and labor market data, but then he pivots to a discussion about the new Trump administration's policies with a nonchalant, whatever. This is the classic case of dancing around topics that are clearly fueling the recessionary pressures seen in many sectors. The Fed might claim that the tariffs will only modestly affect prices, but anyone watching the consumer market knows that even a modest increase in input costs can spell disaster for households already juggling stagnant wage growth against rising living costs. According to a recent survey by the American Enterprise Institute, businesses reported a near 20% drop in planned investments during periods of extreme policy uncertainty. In Europe, similar disruptions caused by political uncertainty resulted in growth slowdowns of nearly 0.5 percentage points in GDP over the course of a year, a figure that economists warn could well be mirrored in the U.S. if policy paralysis persists. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimates that persistent tariffs and uncertain trade policies could cost the U.S. economy as much as $100 billion per year in lost economic growth, a staggering number that should have every policymaker quaking in their boots. If we zoom out, we see an economic environment where the Fed is essentially saying, we'll act when we're sure, while the government's own policies are steadily eroding the surety. Isn't that the epitome of policy paralysis? When both central banks and government executives refuse to make the tough calls, waiting instead for signs to clear, we end up in a stalemate that dooms proactive reform. There's a subtle but telling contradiction in the Fed's remarks. On the one hand, the CPI, whose numbers are raising eyebrows, is treated with a degree of skepticism due to potential seasonal adjustment issues. On the other, the Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE, price index, which is the Fed's so-called favored gauge, comes off looking much more comforting. Let's be clear, if you're in the business of economic forecasting, knowing that two major metrics are painting divergent pictures naturally introduces a host of problems. The CPI spiked by 0.5% in January, while the core PCE inflation is pegged at an annual rate of 2.6%. While the difference might not seem vast from an academic perspective, to ordinary folks this means the official narrative borders on sleight of hand. One moment, inflation appears tame, the next, it's creeping upward in ways that are not fully captured by the core measures. Despite being the Fed's chosen barometer, the core PCE's ability to exclude volatile elements like food and energy is precisely its weakness in the eyes of many critics. After all, when the price of your morning coffee or the gas for your commute skyrockets, those factors are very real and painful, even if they are statistically smoothed by exclusion. In sectors like manufacturing and retail, where raw material costs can fluctuate wildly with global energy prices, smoothing out these effects in statistical reports does not change the reality on the ground. Firms must contend with price volatility, and consumers are forced to bear the brunt of elevated prices in their daily budgets. The disconnect between these indices creates room for political spin. Imagine waving along with a corridor of analysts who cheer on the core PCE while quietly acknowledging that the CPI paints a more ominous picture of real-world inflation. That is precisely the terrain where policy half measures can proliferate, leaving many without the protections that a more responsive monetary policy might offer. A report by the Brookings Institution revealed that while core inflation remained moderate, headline inflation based on CPI rose by nearly 1.2% over a 6-month period, a discrepancy that left many economists scratching their heads over which gauge to trust. Internationally, Japan's inflation data in similar contexts has underscored this debate. When the Bank of Japan had to choose between maintaining low-interest policies and intervening to curb rising consumer prices, the conflicting signals from headline versus core metrics led to policy gridlock and further eroded consumer confidence. Ultimately, the Fed's reliance on favorite indices, while ignoring the broader economic realities experienced by everyday citizens, stands as a clear example of how insufficient data interpretation can ultimately hamper decisive policy action. Meanwhile, the public is left wondering whether they're being fed the full story or merely a polished executive summary. Yet, the golden thread running through all this analysis is the subtle but insidious mismanagement by government policymakers. Waller's aside about the new Trump administration's policies hints at a confidence that borders on ignorance, a laissez-faire attitude that dismisses the potential negative impacts of tariffs and regulatory decisions. Let's not sugarcoat it. When the architects of economic policy choose to embrace uncertainty rather than confront it head-on, the entire system is compromised. Recent decisions to delay rate cuts, even when conditions might warrant them, mirror a broader trend in which policymakers are more comfortable postponing tough decisions than taking bold corrective actions. This wait-and-see approach can escalate tensions in the real economy, where delayed interventions sometimes mean the difference between a mild recession and a full-blown economic downturn. Consider the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. The delay in fiscal policy interventions and a cautionary approach in monetary policy, driven partly by political turmoil, contributed significantly to the depth and persistence of the economic downturn. History, as they say, is a stern teacher. According to a recent survey by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBR, nearly 40% of economists believe that misguided government policies are the primary drivers behind the risk of a new recession in the coming years. Recent forecasts indicate that if monetary policy remains overly cautious, letting inflation uncertainties fester, the U.S. GDP could shrink by as much as 0.8% to 1.5% in the next 2 years, relative to projections made before the current round of political interventions began. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, recently warned that sustained uncertainty in economic policy, particularly in relation to trade and tariffs, could trigger a downward cycle affecting global supply chains and trade flows, which are critical for modern economies. Imagine watching a tightrope walker who refuses to lean one way or the other, claiming that balance is best achieved by standing perfectly still, even as the wind howls around them. That's the picture painted by the Fed's comments in this era of excessive government interference and indecision. The administration's cavalier attitude toward imposing tariffs and other policies could very well prove to be a prologue to economic calamity, yet policymakers continue to parry and thrust with statements that sound more like a script for a political farce than a response to real-world data. In many respects, what we're witnessing is a modern-day parody of effective economic governance. The Federal Reserve, which should ideally be the guardian of monetary stability, finds itself entangled in debate over seasonal adjustments and non-persistent tariffs, all while real sectors of the economy, manufacturing, services, and everyday consumer spending, grapple with an uneven recovery process that is increasingly marked by pockets of recession. The concerns raised by Waller and his colleagues are not confined to the U.S. economy alone. Across the Atlantic, Europe is facing a precarious balancing act as well. Many EU members, still reeling from energy price shocks and geopolitical uncertainties, have resorted to similarly cautious monetary policies, fearing that aggressive rate cuts could trigger runaway inflation when combined with unexpectedly harsh winter conditions or supply chain disruptions. In Germany, one of Europe's economic engines, recent inflation data suggested a similar pattern. Headline inflation figures frequently overshoot the central bank's comfort levels by 0.4% to 0.7% during winter months. Analysts there have noted that residual seasonality might be at work as well, complicating policy decisions. The Bank of England, in its latest briefing, cautioned that if data reflective of seasonal adjustments continue to misrepresent underlying trends, the country might face a surge in inflation that outpaces wage growth, a scenario eerily reminiscent of some of the early warning signs in the U.S. Emerging economies have also taken note. For instance, Brazil's central bank has had to navigate a labyrinth of inflation indicators and seasonally skewed data, echoing the uncertainties that currently haunt the US and European policymakers. This global lens reinforces an important takeaway: when economic data is riddled with imperfections and uncertainty, when numbers are adjusted so heavily that their underlying reliability is in question, there is little room for bold or decisive monetary action. Much like a captain trying to navigate a storm without a clear view from the bridge, central bankers across the world find themselves at risk of steering into troubled waters. International investors look for consistency in economic policies. The current environment of half measures and politicized data interpretation sends a clear message: economies might be less stable than at first glance. Recent market volatility, evidenced by wild swings in bond yields and currency pairs, is a testament to the nervousness that even global financial centers are feeling in the face of inconsistent policy signals. With the IMF forecasting a potential global slowdown of 0.5% to 1% if major economies fail to coordinate effective monetary responses, the ripple effects of today's indecisiveness may be felt far beyond the confines of domestic fiscal debates. So, where do we go from here? The playbook for the Fed, and indeed for any central bank, should be rooted in decisive, data-driven actions rather than reactive dithering. Unfortunately, the current strategy of wait until the uncertainty clears is a recipe for inertia and potentially deepened recessions. The Fed must lay its cards on the table and commit to transparent, predictable policy adjustments. While market fluctuations are inevitable, clear guidance can mitigate the kind of investor and consumer panic that only deepens recessions. Given the persistent issues with seasonal adjustments, it might be time for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and related institutions to re-examine their methodologies. Embracing machine learning models or alternative data sources from real-time transactions could offer a clearer picture of inflationary trends. It is not enough for the Fed to act in isolation. Coordination with fiscal policy, targeted government spending, tax adjustments, and real structural reforms can help offset some of the uncertainties inherent in using lagging economic indicators to drive policy decisions. Recognizing that today's economic problems are not confined to national borders, central banks should engage in greater dialogue with their global counterparts. A coordinated response could help address the systemic risks posed by inconsistent data interpretations and the ensuing policy paralysis. As Waller mentioned, the tariffs imposed by the current administration might modestly increase prices. But the cumulative effect on supply chains and consumer spending can be significant. A more nuanced trade policy, one that balances theoretical supply benefits with tangible price pressures, could help stabilize markets and restore confidence. At the recent Economic Policy Symposium in New York, several leading economists advocated for a data-first approach where high-frequency economic indicators, like credit card expenditures and real-time labor market data, complement traditional surveys. Such an approach could significantly reduce the reliance on problematic seasonal adjustments. Moreover, a joint statement by a coalition of financial institutions called for an integrated policy framework that forces fiscal authorities and central banks to share data and decisions in near real time. This isn't just bureaucratic posturing, it's a pragmatic response to a problem that grows more acute every quarter. In a recent op-ed in The Economist, a panel of global economic experts argued that as long as central banks continue to rely on controlled experiments of monetary policy, i.e., rate cuts when conditions seem right, they risk missing the broader picture of structural economic weakness. Instead, a more robust policy framework that prioritizes long-term reforms over short-term fixes is needed. In wrapping up this analysis, let's be candid. The Fed's recent statements, replete with caveats and conditional promises, are symptomatic of a wider economic malaise, one that is as much about data uncertainties as it is about political double-talk. While Governor Waller's assurance that, if 2025 plays out like 2024, rate cuts would be appropriate at some point this year might sound optimistically conditional, it is ultimately an admission of the inherent vulnerability in policymaking during times of rapid and unpredictable change. For ordinary citizens, rising prices at the grocery store, unpredictable job prospects, and the nagging notion that the economic ground beneath them is shifting unseen are real concerns. For professionals in the financial sector, the uncertainty surrounding seasonal adjustments, residual inflation, and the consequences of delayed policy actions is nothing short of a professional nightmare. And for investors and global stakeholders, well, they're watching the theatrics unfold, betting that the Fed will eventually step up, but knowing that the longer the paralysis drags on, the deeper the economic scars will become. In a world where headline inflation figures can be manipulated by residual seasonality and where political uncertainty only adds to the fog of economic data, critical thinking is more important than ever. The time has come for policymakers to move beyond excuses and half-measures, to adopt a bold, data-driven, and globally coordinated approach to address not only the symptoms but also the root causes of today's economic vulnerabilities. Ultimately, clarity in communication and decision-making is the antidote to the creeping dread of a recession. When the public, investors, and businesses are confident that their leaders are taking decisive actions, the economy can begin to find its footing even in the stormiest of times. As we look back at the Fed's performance over the past year, from lowered rates to cautious holds, from questionable seasonal adjustments to tacit admissions of policy paralysis, we must ask ourselves, is this the best we can do, or is it time for a radical rethinking of economic governance? The choice, as always, lies with those in power. But history tells us that during periods of great uncertainty, boldness is the mother of stability. Let's hope the policymakers decide to brave the storm rather than wait for the skies to clear on their own. In the meantime, for anyone who's been following this saga, be you a concerned citizen, a savvy investor, or an economist with ink-stained hands, the message is clear: don't be lulled into a false sense of security by words like mildly disappointing or sweet spot. The economic reality is messy, unpredictable, and, if we're not careful, heading toward a recession punctuated by paralysis and indecision. Only by addressing the data issues, overhauling outdated policy models, and finally taking responsibility for our economic future can we hope to temper the unfolding chaos. This concludes our deep dive into the Fed's latest pronouncements and the broader economic implications they carry. Whether you're watching this from your living room couch or burning the midnight oil in your office, remember that in the realm of economic policy, words matter, and so do the numbers. Stay informed, stay critical, and as always, keep your eyes wide open in these tumultuous times.